Hello. Welcome to the webinar. I'm just going to busk for a few minutes while some people come into the webinar. We're really delighted to be talking about the state of startups with industry analysts. I'm going to let a few more people join the webinar because you know how it is with webinars, and then I'm going to introduce our speakers quickly, and then we're going to go into talk about what is happening. Some things that I need to say are firstly about the Q&A. You will see that there is a Q&A thing at the bottom of the screen. Please use that if you have questions. We're going to be taking plenty of time at the end of the webinar for questions. We guarantee if we can't take a question in the conversation, then we will answer it by email later on. Also, if you want a copy of the slides, then reach out to one of the speakers, and they can help you. Yeah, they would love to spread the good news about what's going on. I'm just going to say a few words to introduce Chris and Robin and Neil. They will be known, I'm sure, to many of the people on the webinar today. But CC Group is really delighted to have this piece of research, and personally, I should have introduced myself in case anyone doesn't know me. I'm Duncan Chappell. I head up the Analyst Relations team here at CC, and also I'm a co-director of Pollock speakers of the Analyst Observatory at the University of Edinburgh School, through which these data have been collected with the support of our forensic spotlight and our insights. We're joined today by Chris Holscher. Chris is an analyst relations leader and an analyst relations consultant in Hamburg. And I think it's fair to say, Chris, that I think the genius idea for this survey is really yours and Robin's. And you've really come up with this idea and made it happen. And Robin Schaffer in New Jersey is a extremely long-standing analyst relations leader, both in-house and now as a consultant with her own firm, Schaffer AR, same circle there. And then Neil Pollock, who is one of the Professor Neil Pollock, is one of the scholars who has really, not just paid the most attention to industry analyst firms like Gartner, but in a way has kind of, with his co-authors, expanded massively academic interest in industry analysts as a phenomenon. These are really three fantastic speakers to have here today to give context to these findings and to start to outline what we can do with this knowledge, what we can do with this insight. The final thing I want to say before we start is that this webinar is being recorded. Yeah. If you ask a question in the Q&A, I'm going to do my very best to not use your name, or maybe use only your first name. I don't want you to be hold yourself back from posting questions by the idea that your name may be associated with validity or whatever of the question. All questions can be welcome. Yeah. Each of our three speakers has played a different role in the study and has got a different perspective on it. So actually, I just wanted to open up by inviting each of them just to say, something about, the research project and the thing that stood out the most for them, perhaps, in the study. I wonder, Chris, can I invite you to kind of open up this conversation of kind of reviewing things and outlining the findings together with Robin and Chris?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Duncan. I hope my audio is a bit better than yours, because yours broke up quite a bit.
Yeah,
can you all hear me well?
You are really clear.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so maybe you want to
I'll change my headset.
Check yours. Okay, so thank you so much. The state of startups with industry analysts. Key findings. Yeah, we really excited to talk about this. Had the idea a long while ago, because what really drove me into this field was that over my many years of working with BT Global Services as an analyst relations lead, one thing that I heard in the more casual conversations over and over again from analysts was they love to speak more to startups, yet they cannot afford the time because startups don't, or many startups don't really understand the game, the analyst relations game, and therefore they have to prioritize their precious time on those players who are analyst relations savvy. And that is really, really a pity. And that drove me, I couldn't stop thinking about that. And at some point decided, I want to change this. I want to dive into this field specifically and entirely focus on analyst relations for startups in the B2B tech space and help them close this gap, and basically help both sides close this gap. And one thing that I understood early was that I can tell lots of interesting stories about why startups could do better when engaging with analysts, and how and tell stories of how it didn't work out because they just didn't liaise in the right way and use them in the right way. But stories are just stories. So what startups rightfully so really want is data. So came up with the idea to produce a bit of research, and found a wonderful partner in crime with Robin Schaffer, who I knew through her wonderful book, Analysts on Analyst Relations, and with Neil Pollock as well as leading the institute at the University of Edinburgh. So I was really glad to find partners in crime to do this bit of research, and it really helped the research get just so much better than if I had done it on my own, or done my own little try at it. I remember countless nights of discussing with Robin, and many good instances of going through the research and the design and everything with Neil, and that was just incredibly useful. So couldn't be more thankful. We had fantastic partners with, as I said, the university, in terms of the conceptual support of the research, using some of their infrastructure as well, and the data analysis. One face you haven't seen here on the slide is Alina Kakimova, who helped us from the statistics point of view, kept us honest with all the data, not over-analyzing stuff, and that was immensely helpful. And then also, of course, our wonderful sponsors, who you will for sure know, the two 400-pound gorillas, as we like to say, in the analyst relations space, AR Insights and Spotlight Analyst Relations, the powerhouses behind Architect and Spotlight Oz, who served again as sparring partners for our thinking, and also with the outreach to participants and promotion of the results and everything. So that was great. One thing that I want to point out here is that none of our sponsors at any point ever requested any bit of grip on the data itself, or influencing the way how we ask questions, and that very speaks to the quality of these companies and their understanding of how to support this research. Thank you so much to that. So without much further ado, I'll jump into the findings, and I'll do a very quick run through today, and I can only encourage you to go to either schafferar.com or to my website holscher.one to download the full report. It's a 27-page report with lots of data, lots of detail. It's packed with insights, and we can only scratch the surface today. So please do go to one of these pages and download it. We also have a much more in-depth webinar about it that is like 56 minutes talking data straight, that will dive into many more aspects than we can today. But today we'll have more focus on the conversation. And in order to get to that, I'll just quickly go through a couple of slides here. So in terms of the demographics of the people that we interviewed and surveyed, we reached out to 3 different groups, actually. That was the first group was the startups and scale-ups themselves. They had to be in the B2B tech space, and they had to be no older than 10 years in business. The second group was industry analysts, of course, who would deal with startups. We had no regional limitations, so but generally the majority of respondents were from either North America or throughout Europe. Then the third group who we reached out to were the startup ecosystem, so startup accelerators and venture capital firms and this kind of players. They all received more or less the same questionnaire, but just asked them from their specific angle so that we could bounce their answers off of each other and see how the different groups would have their views on a specific field. Now, if we look at the startups specifically, I'm very, very pleased that we had a really nice, even distribution of both startups with experience of analyst relations and those who have not been exposed to this topic before. And so here you see that 57% had AR experience at their current startup, and another 20% at previous startups, and then 22 with no AR experience at all. And that gives us a good basis to understand the 360-degree view and not just have startups who would celebrate analyst relations because they think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. So we got the full 360-degree view. Now, if we look into the motivation of why analysts actually want to work with startups, I had, this is one of the findings that I like best. And let me start from the bottom here. The typical answer that you get is, oh, we want to support all these wonderful entrepreneurs. You know, this is such a good thing that they do. Young, motivated, energetic people, this has to be supported. And this kind of answer, support entrepreneurs, just got 50-50 yay, nay agreement. And what was much more prevalent here as a reason to liaise with startups from the analyst side is answers like, we want to understand new offerings. We want to decide on vendors to track. We want to even identify vendors to actively recommend to our buy-side clients. So these answers are very clearly end client driven and are very, which is, I believe, a very encouraging bit of data for our audiences. Now, if we look at the same kind of question from the other angle, from the startup's perspective, the value that they expect to get from analysts kind of divides in three major categories. So there's the outbound value, pushing your brand reputation, improving your brand awareness, or even helping investors to validate you as a business. So that's outbound value that they expect. And that clearly takes the top spots here. The inbound value in terms of getting feedback into the business, insights and ideas is somewhere in the middle. And then what we dive into a little bit more in detail on the next slide is that the market influence clearly is ranging at the bottom. And let me make this a little bit more drastic here. If we compare these two data points, you know, what the analyst motivation on the bottom there, identify vendors to recommend, with almost 80% of analysts saying that that is one of their primary motivations. And then on the other hand, startups' value expectation in terms of exposure to tech buyers, only with 27% of startups seeing that as a high value that they think that can get from analysts. I believe that demonstrates the incredible gap that we have between startups and industry analysts in terms of, you know, the two groups not really getting together as they should at this point. Now, I think that slide alone is a very important finding, but let me show you something really interesting, because this changes over time. Now, we asked startups about their perception of analysts, you know, knowledge and their trustworthiness and their independence. And the more a startup really engages with analysts, clearly these indicators go up steeply. So if you look here from don't work with analysts, the independence perception of an analyst firms is typically ranges at a 4 out of a scale from 0 to 9, and that then grows from low to medium and high maturity of them engaging with analysts to 6.5, and the trustworthiness even goes higher up. So I think this is a glowing endorsement of the quality of the work that analysts are doing with startups, and I believe this kind of experience can change the gap that we had on this page. We just need to get it through them. So let's dive into the next section. We asked, so when do you believe as a startup should you begin to engage with industry analysts, and what drives that that need to engage with industry analysts? And clearly analysts and startups both agree very much that product maturity is the driver. Other factors like situational, like when a competitor was discussed in an analyst publication, or expansion when you want to reach new geographies, or your revenue level or time in business, those range much lower. So we looked at the product maturity on a scale from minimal viable product all the way to beta stage, broad availability, and reference customers for a startup, and asked them, so at what point particularly on this journey do you believe it makes sense for you to reach out to analysts? And we asked this the startups, of course, and we asked it the industry analysts as well from their perspective. And here you see that startups expect that they need to be much more mature on their journey in order to meaningfully be able to reach out to analysts than what analysts say themselves. Analysts want to hear from startups much earlier than the majority of startups assume. So it's more than 50% want to hear from startups at beta stage or before, with even almost 20% of analysts saying, I want to hear from startups even at their minimal viable product stage, which clearly speaks to their kind of, excuse me, but nerdy interest in the topic. I want to know everything about whatever my field of research is. It's not much value for me to recommend the IBMs of this world. I need to know the complete playing field. I need to know the innovators. I need to know the bloody edge that is out there in the market. So very clearly, again, underpinning the earlier bits of data that I showed to you. Now, we also asked, so have you as a startup been covered so far by industry analysts? And some 60% almost have been covered within the first 10 years. Some 21% were not covered, and another 20% didn't even know whether anybody's written about them or not. And if we look at the 59% of startups who have been covered by analysts in their first 10 years, the mean age was at around seven years in business. Now, what I find really breathtaking is that there are almost 20% again of startups having been covered within their first 3 years in business. Because that means if you do analyst relations right as a startup, you have a real opportunity to pull that brand coverage forward by as much as 4 years. And that is pretty impressive. I mean, if you count startup in dogs' lives, I mean, that's a life, that's several lifetimes almost for a startup. If you consider that half of startups die before they are even 5 years old, and you then think pulling their brand visibility forward by as much as 4 years against the average, that is in fact a lifetime of many startups. So that is really, really powerful. Then, of course, we asked them, so what, the industry analysts, what would you wish for if you could? How do you think startups could improve their game? How could they improve briefing you? And the two main points are less marketing speak and better quality briefings, which is pretty much what Robin and I expected. But it is just good to see that come on top. What I find really interesting in this particular data set is that just over 50%, 51% of analysts said they would love a more comprehensive engagement from startups. And that is more than twice as much as analysts who said we want more frequent interactions. So it is not that much about the cadence, how often I brief an analyst. No, it's all about the comprehensiveness, about the depth, about the 360-degree picture, because analysts really want to understand you in order to really see what drives you and see where the industry is going and potentially be able to help you as well. So that was another really strong finding, I believe. Then we asked them, of course, so what do you want to see in briefings? And not surprisingly, product technology is up there at 90%. I was rather surprised that this wasn't like 99-point-something%, but only 90% here. But what I found, again, really impressive was something as well often dismissed and being smiled upon, like vision and mission of a company, ranges a lot further up than even your roadmap or your financial information or competitive view. That was quite impressive for me. And the reason is, again, it ties in with the rest of the data that we saw, that your vision and your mission, so your view of the ideal world that you want to, that you're working towards, and your contribution to help the world get there, says a lot about your company, about your thinking, your aspirations, even the way how you define your strategy. So it's telling a great bit of depth about your business. So they absolutely want to see this. So 4 out of the top 5 points here are of strategic character and not so much of technology character. Then, of course, we couldn't help but ask, so how do you organize yourselves? And 80% of the companies that we spoke to said, yeah, we do work with industry analysts in an active way, and some 21% didn't. And then those 79 or 80%, we asked, so who's leading on AR? And most of them say it's the C-level, and then we have some 20%, handling it through analyst relations specifically, or somewhere in their marketing team. Or I was surprised that the ad hoc didn't get a higher percentage, but maybe people didn't want to tell that. But then we compared these groups on, so how effectively is analyst relations perceived by the analyst side, based on who is leading AR. And of course, analyst relations specialists like us, we are great, and everybody will agree with that. So of course, we come out on top there with a 75% positive rating. And the real interesting thing here, I believe, is the net rate. So if you deduct the negative ratings, so ineffective or very ineffective, and actually also the neutral from the positives, that will make the picture more drastic and more telling, and it was quite informative for us. So I believe that concludes the data that we wanted to share as a hopefully quick enough run through today. I can only encourage you to go download the report. There's tons of more data, and there's especially also Robin and I took quite an effort to interpret the data, to put it in context, to put it in perspective for people who either are specialists already and may want to derive something for how they handle analyst relations in their organizations, or for accelerators and VCs and startups themselves, of course. So actionable advice, what can you do with it? What does it mean for you? So please.
I want to jump in, Chris, as we were saying before, even though this is a study of startups and scale-ups to a degree with analyst relations, we saw tremendous value in this data for established AR teams with established vendors. Because if you think about it, there's much learning in here about how to engage with analysts on innovation and particularly like skunkworks projects and things within just about every company that are like a startup within an established company. And most of our AR people need to represent that and need to know how to use that part of the business to differentiate themselves and to gain mind share with the analysts. So we think even if you are in a mid-size or even large company, looking at your role in analyst relations, there's a lot of value here in understanding how analysts and startups specifically engage.
Exactly, exactly. And that's really why we wanted to share this data with you today, to see, because we know you're not all working at a startup, you're working in all sorts of organizations, likely larger ones. And we wanted to share this data with you because we believe this can help you also inspire some of your work. And if you're working, if you have, a company like Oracle supported our research because they have their own startup accelerator activities, and their analyst relations team, of course, wants to understand, so how do we best support our startups in engaging with analysts? Are there differences? So we felt this can inform your thinking as well, and maybe there is even a job opportunity for you in the startup ecosystem.
Startups are exciting places to be, and
definitely,
AR people
definitely
often don't see that as an opportunity for themselves. So consider it.
So, and I guess with that, we'll hand back over to Duncan again.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Neil, I wonder if I can put the first question over to you. Can you say something about the prior research experience with startups, and what has really led to interest becoming crystallized with this study in particular?
Thank you, Duncan. So we approached this, we got interested in the startup several years ago, and we had a slightly different interest. And our study was funded by the Economic Social Research Council, which is one of the main UK research funders. And we were trying to tackle this question specifically about the UK, which has many vibrant startups, but very few which grow and scale. And are able to move into international markets. So that was what interested us. What was the obstacles? What was the barriers? And we were interested in obviously we recognized that the role of the industry analyst was important here. And we did an initial study looking at, for example, at Gartner's cool vendor. So asking and talking to startups, how did they achieve the cool vendor status? What did they do? Did they proactively search it out? Did they pitch to Gartner? And then the second part was to look at what happened. So once you became a cool vendor, did it make a difference? Did it have any impact on whether you had new customer leads or more investor interest, and generally what happened to the survival rate of the startup? And that was really what kind of got us started. And then we began to focus a bit more on the startups themselves, and we had this. We came across interesting comparisons between, really promising startups here in the UK. One in Glasgow, providing e-commerce, and we compared it to another Chicago-based e-commerce startup, both on kind of similar journeys with really good technology. But the Scottish startup was floundering, and in contrast, the Chicago-based one was actually doing really well. And part of that was this work they'd done. The owner was a serial entrepreneur, so had experience working with people like Gartner and Forrester in the past. So he was right from the start trying to get onto their radar. Whereas the Scottish startup in Glasgow, they had some knowledge. They knew who Gartner were, but they didn't really know, how to talk to them. They didn't know how to approach them. Which analyst should they speak to? What should they say? Should they do their investor pitch? How should they, what was the analyst looking for? What do they want to hear? So they were just really kind of floundering in terms of understanding the basics of, how to approach the pitch to the analyst, and, how to fit into their categories, and, what if they were, they're cross category, and which analyst should they talk to? And there was a real sense that, that from our research point of view was that lots of the UK startups were kind of missing out on something quite important, not quite an endorsement, but obviously getting onto the radar of the analyst firms was actually having an important influence on various aspects. And that contrasted quite interestingly with some of the startups in other parts of the world. Say, if you take the example of in the States or in Israel, where we saw that there were high numbers of startups who had become cool vendors. So obviously these firms, these startups were doing something, interacting more with analysts in a way in which the UK startup wasn't. So that was really what kind of got us interested in this world.
Thank you. Really intriguing. Chris, I wonder, you've spoken through some of the specific data points, and obviously, you know, many of these really are hugely intriguing. But what would you say are some of the major outcomes for the study? You know, what is going to really help support our experience as practitioners, I suppose, from these findings?
So the major outcome, the main outcome for me was really the enormous, and this came throughout all the questions that we had and throughout all the analysis that we did. Everything came back to the theme of insights-driven analyst relations. So while many people in our industry, I would say, have a relatively outbound understanding of analyst relations, or at least that's, for many people, that's the nucleus of everything. So how do I get my message to these influencers? In the startup space, that is the emphasis seems to be much more on getting insights into the business. And that has probably to do with a startup being much more in a self-finding phase, and needs to make some really bold decisions, and needs to make these decisions very, very fast, because typically innovation pops up everywhere around the world at roughly the same time. And then it's all about, winning that race. And you can win that race much easier if you take all the information that you can get from someone like analysts, who do nothing else but monitor this market and monitor this competition and monitor the problems of the clients in a breadth and depth that you as a startup can never, replicate as an individual. And if you can get all this insight into your company and take it into the wheelhouse, into your inner workings, in your product development, in your go-to-market, in your strategy, in your everything, that helps you to make these bolder decisions faster. So that emphasis on insights value specifically in the startup space, that came through in almost every question. And the consistency with that this insight came surfaced in the research, that I found really impressive, and also frankly quite encouraging, because it makes the entire game so much more interesting. It's so much more fun. I practice this every day with my clients, and this is the fun part. This is where my clients see the real value, and so I found that quite impressive.
I wanted to jump in, because I have worked with, and you have also, Chris, worked with much larger companies. And I find that the insight focus for any company of any size is less than it could be. For startups, it's particularly interesting, because startups are pivoting all the time.
Yes.
So they have the wherewithal to take this kind of input and act on it. Where larger companies, in my experience, have a lot more trouble shifting, pivoting, and moving, because it's a bigger ship. But those that do that understand that these analysts are not just a channel of influence, but a channel of insights, can really have a stronger impact on their business than a mention in a Gartner, report or something. So it's one of those ways that this outcome and this research can inform the way we all do analyst relations, no matter the size of the business.
Yes.
Could I just add to that as well, another point, which is kind of interesting, because with some of the search that Duncan and I did, we actually looked at the pitches themselves, and we were kind of interested building and understanding how does the analyst pitch differ from, the traditional pitch to the investor. And I think that we were keen to do that because we wanted to build a more general understanding. So I teach postgraduates, and I talked about these kinds of pitches, and we talk a lot about the VC pitch in our business school, but we actually don't mention at all the analyst pitch. So we kind of thought more about this aspect, and we have this kind of term for it. We call it the valorizing pitch. In terms of, obviously analysts don't endorse the ventures. That's not what they're trying to do, but they're adding some kind of value to them. And so it is things like, talking about them, putting them on a stage, kind of holding hands as well. So the pivoting was quite interesting, where the ventures pivoting between categories. And we found that, and often the analyst, although they don't give feedback, they found with the startup, they're often being quite directional in terms of helping them pivot between categories, giving them kind of, prodding them towards certain areas, and helping them pivot. So that kind of knowledge was really, I think, invaluable, and it's helped us, try to characterize what is a very different kind of pitching phenomena.
Yeah, totally.
Robin, I wonder if I can. You make this point about the way that many firms can benefit from engaging, but then the low median score on the chart that Chris showed about trust in analysts, that suggests that maybe startups have got very different engagement with analysts. So could you say something like how engaged are startups with analysts?
That is one thing. Chris talked about how we have, I think all of us have a very intuitive understanding of this market and sought to do this study to understand the state, as it says, the state of analysts and in startups and industry analysts. What I think the reality is that very few startups and even scale-ups are very engaged and are doing this with quality, right? I think the actual data shows a higher level of engagement than is actually true. And that is a logical thing, because as we went out to startups and we invited them to provide their input, those were more likely, those that had some familiarity and experience with analysts were more likely to participate in the research. So it's kind of skewed to tell you, if you looked at it, that startups are more engaged with analysts than I believe, and Chris believes, and I think you guys believe, is the reality.
Yeah,
I think there's a lot of education to do in this market. We found, what we're excited about is we've really found some strong value to startups of using this this tool, right? They're a tool, and a low awareness, and that's why this research we worked with Neil and created the research, and why we're eager to get the knowledge in the hands of as many people as we can.
Chris, I mean, it sounds like what you have then is something that is simultaneously offers great insight into how analysts are working with startups, but also data in a way from a group of people who might be like real power users of the analysts, many of them. So what does this data mean for AR pros at medium, large vendors? Is there something that they should be learning from the way that startups are engaging with analysts, or the way that analysts are getting something from startups that they can't get from the larger vendors?
Possibly, yes. So if I look at what it could mean for larger vendors, I think we touched on it before, that I think this insights-driven approach is something that they can learn from, because it can help them also in an organization that is large, that is more rigid than a startup. Getting this insights into the company can help you actually change things, can help you actually push things forward. You can actively use it. So that is certainly something that you can use in large organizations as well, and from this research. Then the other point, of course, is if you are in a large organization and you have your own skunkworks innovation team somewhere, in a side building and creating the next Macintosh. As the analyst relations team, you want to support them as well, and so you need to understand how this works and what their specific needs are and all that, and because that is clearly different if you need to get on analyst radars at first in order, make that hurdle to get into the game at all, that's an entirely different setup than if you are a $100 million company already, and people have you on the radar and they know you exist and they've heard your name in customer conversations come up. That's an entirely different game then. So yeah, there's a lot for that. Robin?
Yeah, I just was going to reiterate, in my experience working with many vendors, even in the core business, there are innovations. There are new ideas. There are smart people coming up with new ideas to break down the market and add value to the market. And I think all of us should look at those innovative ideas as a little different from the normal updates and the normal latest, features, but really present them in a different way and talk about the business model of them and talk about not just the technology itself, but some of these learnings about the way startups present themselves. How do larger established companies present innovation within their business? And it might not be a skunk works.
But Robin, I mean, if we're talking about the way that the vendors need to think about new ways of representing value propositions, isn't there also something here about, I mean, aren't these data also quite a challenge for analyst firms? I think what the findings suggest to me is that, that there's a large addressable market for analyst firms that some analyst firms are failing with. And do analyst firms need to rethink their business models, because they're clearly antagonizing a lot of something is happening, something wrong is going on.
I think it's unfortunately quite true. And from my work with startups, Chris's work with startups, all of our knowledge and the data, it shows that there is some kind of a mismatch with the offers that analyst firms, they offer, and the way they approach startups, and the things that are sort of more, have stronger ROI for a startup. So where a more mature company may trust that this kind of investment, this kind of significant investment will bring them value. Startups are more skeptical, I find, and are more bootstrapped and don't have the money to put out quite a large sum of money. They also have misunderstandings about pay to play. So I think that analyst firms need to understand the cyclical nature of startups, how getting that wheel going and getting startups to experience what the value that they can get from that insights-driven side, because frankly, they can do the marketing side without an investment, with little investment, but they want to really get insights and get research and get that kind of incoming value. They have to pay for it, right? And most startups, in my experience, don't in the beginning recognize the value of that. And I think the analyst firms make that too high of a threshold to start to understand that value. They also can see more tangible ROI in something like a white paper or a case study or some marketing type piece that can show them the value of what the analyst's name and thought can add to their thought leadership or their marketing material. So I think if you understand startups and the way they think, the analyst firms may approach selling to them and educating them differently.
Can I add to that? Just a very practical perspective. I mean, consider if I want to sign up with Forrester or with Gartner for startup support subscription, that is somewhere around 35, 40, 50K, depending on which region you're in, per year. Now,
More.
if startups, or more, if startups, if analysts want to hear from startups at minimal viable product stage and want to engage with them more comprehensively, then these two data points don't really go together very well. Because if I'm 2 years old or 1 year old, I probably do not have a marketing or product development or strategy development budget of that dimension. So startups need something that is more tailored to their stage at which they're playing. I mean, with every investment round, they will grow their budgets and will grow their possibilities. And analysts should appreciate that. And just like Robin said, give them something tangible that is easier for them to make a decision on and convince their board on, and help them, tap into this field. Then next year and the next year after, things change, of course. And you can be, as an analyst house, you can be open about that and say, well, we make this entry level offer and it will, it will change over time, just for you to see the value and experience it. There is another point as well, though. So we also spoke to the accelerator and VC side of things and questioned them. And I think there is a big role for VCs and accelerators to help startups appreciate this part of the playing field. They don't have to do it for them. They don't have to do analyst relations for them. And we got some data that shows how analysts perceive VCs and accelerators practicing analyst relations for startups is not so good. But what they can do is help them understand the importance of the topic, and help them maybe connect to analyst relations practitioners who can help them make their first steps in the right direction and make that investment decision with more confidence, and maybe also guide it in a way that makes sense for them. So that is, I believe, very important on that question.
And Neil, I wonder if this mention of incubators is an interesting way of kind of bridging over to a public policy perspective. I mean, here in the UK, probably in many other countries, many incubators and accelerators are part of public sector backed organizations, science parks, university incubators, and so on. So do these findings, what's the significance of these findings for public institutions and people engaged in public policy?
I think they're quite important. I think Chris just kind of began to point out some of what we think of the next stages of our research, which is, so rather than going out to individual startups, is to teach the teachers. So those people who institutionally talk to lots of startups all the time, like the accelerators, and get this, it's partially about showing them the contours of the pitch, but also things like, when we've talked to, I think we've all experienced this when talking to startups, there's quite a lot of myths around about, and Robin mentioned the myth of pay to play. So you have to be a subscriber, to talk to Gartner, but there, rather than the other mechanisms that are available for you to go and pitch. So part of it is kind of myth busting about what it is these actors do and how to approach them. But generally just trying to try and educate the educator, and there's quite a lot of interest in the UK. And if I think of my own, where I'm sat in Edinburgh, and the Scottish government are really keen to find ways to address the scaling problem, and it fits into kind of broader agendas around Brexit, etc., etc. But it's just really a key interest here at the moment. And so the geographical thing is, I think, quite important, because currently there are no analyst firms in Scotland, and you can see it makes a difference. So when you talk to startups, the level of understanding is really low. So again, so part of our second phase could be thinking of ways, innovative ways to address that problem. And you and I, Duncan, have talked about the airport days that some regional governments in Germany have organized, where they've flown in key analysts for their startups and brought them together in half-day kinds of events to get these people to meet up and to share knowledge, etc., etc. So it could be that that in certain circumstances it might need very innovative kinds of techniques like this.
Yep.
Thank you. Is there Robin, I want to make sure that we leave time for questions, but
yes, we do.
Is there anything else that surprised you in these data?
As I mentioned, I thought the level of engagement of startups was a little skewed, right?
Yes.
But the thing that mostly surprised me was the gap between value and understanding of startups, time when they can access the analysts' interest in them, and that real gap about value and interest was surprising to me. I didn't expect it to be that strong.
Yeah,
And Chris, Neil has spoken about what one way of taking forward the study, which is really taking forward the findings of the study to try to, for example, to feed into the way that educators are better preparing entrepreneurs. Are there other ways in which you're planning to take the study forward? I do believe you intend to run the survey again in a couple of years, but what else is on the agenda?
Well, definitely. So, well, as you said, of course, we want to make this an ongoing research. So either on an annual or biannual basis, we'll drive this forward and we'll stick to the core questionnaire, but then amend it with special interest topics that we will then dive into and amend the core questionnaire with in-depth views on certain topics on a likely a biannual basis. But before we do this, the next thing that we want to do, because we receive tons of really interesting verbatims also in the questionnaires, because we had the possibilities to give comments on all questions, and people were very generous with providing us with their comments, and this was super interesting. So we decided to start an interview series with the most interesting contributors on all sides. On the startup side, scale-ups have also participated, then VCs, accelerators, and the analyst side, to say, so what's your perspective? Where do you come from? What was your journey? What were your experiences? What would you recommend to other startups, to other firms, whatever, so that we can add a little bit more, background to this and make it visible and tangible for people on YouTube and features like that. And then we'll in parallel, we'll also do more qualitative analyses with special tools that we'll use in the coming days, really, with the analyst side as a first step, but then probably also with the other sides. So yeah, we'll take this forward in this kind of direction, but the very next step is that we want to get it in as many hands as possible, especially in the startup ecosystem, of course. So if you're listening, if you have contacts in the startup world, or if to accelerators or to VCs, please do send them our way. It's an enormously large ecosystem. We can only reach so many people, but we really want to spread the word. I believe the more people who understand analyst relations with that background, with a data-based background, it can help the entire industry, and it can help. I believe it can also help analyst relations professionals at large vendors, because if we all help startups avoid SKU analysts, people who pretend they are analysts but are really something very different, we can help protect the value of this industry. And I think that's a very important role, not just for the startups, but for the entirety of the game. So please, if you have contacts in the accelerator, venture capital, any startup hubs world, send them to Robin, Neil, myself, and that would be great.
Fantastic. I'm going to invite anyone who has questions to type questions into the little Q&A panel at the bottom of the screen, and then if there are none, then what I might do is kind of go to Neil, Robin, and Chris and ask them to make any concluding thoughts and comments that they have. Somebody asked about getting hold of the results. I put a link in the chat to the Analyst Observatory page, where you can read more about the study and see Chris Holscher's contact details there. But really, anybody involved in this webinar can help you to get hold of the results. And I'm sure also the research team would be delighted in speaking to you or your organization, other organization you might be involved in, about the findings. There's just a huge amount of insight here, which is valuable for all these different audiences that we have spoken about.
One thing, Duncan, that we'd be interested to hear about would be to ask the audience, if you were doing this study, what would you suggest we look at next? ideas. And so we've talked about, we did the map cool vendors, we talked to the range of different stakeholders, we looked at the pitches, tried to characterize them. But what else could we do that might be interesting from a research point of view or a practical point of view?
This webinar is a really difficult format for that. Type it in as a question or something, or maybe send an email to Chris.
Yes.
It would be really intriguing to think of ways that these that we could develop this and not just repeat it, but develop it. Make it deep. I think if sorry, Robin, you were saying.
Oh, I just want to close. If we don't have any questions, I can make a some closing remarks. I came to this, Chris and I came together. We kind of had some separate ideas. Chris was more formulated in how we could approach it. But I also had the core question that I wanted to answer through data, which was, are analysts important, effective, and impactful on startups, and how? Because we intuitively knew that because we've worked with startups, we've seen it, we've seen, stories, plenty of stories of the value. But we wanted to do research to kind of get the data behind that. So it's not just us talking, all of us on the call and those others that are in the space, but have data that supported us. So this was like really going out on a ledge because sometimes data doesn't support what you've intuitively experienced. But it did. So I'm particularly really proud of it and very eager. I think this market clearly benefits from this kind of education, and I'm eager to, Chris and I and Neil are really eager to do that.
Amen. Yes.
Neil, can I ask you to chip in your thoughts, final words?
No, just that, from the university point of view, it's been really exciting kind of research project. It's been really great to work with both Robin and Chris and Duncan for you hosting this. And I mean, one of the things that we're really interested in, a variety of things, but is what the analyst firms are going to do next in terms of, because they're beginning to reach out more to the startups and recognize the importance. So it'd be quite interesting to know about what their strategies are in, down the line of the next few years about engaging more with startups. So you can see them do that. So with the Gartner new format pitches, I think it's called the Shark Tank pitches or something similar. So it'd be really interesting to find out what they have and what plans they have for new forms of engagement.
Great.
Yeah, definitely. And we already do see companies like GigaOM also coming from a different angle into the industry, actively looking for new ways, better ways to engage with that audience and with innovators. Slightly, from a very innovative analyst perspective as well. So there's a lot of music in this space.
Fantastic. On that tuneful note, I will pull the webinar to a close. Thank you so much to our presenters, Neil, Robin, Chris, not just for presenting, but for making this study happen. I think it's really crystallized a lot of things that we suspected, but also really shown very sharply the depth of the untapped opportunities that exist on all sides around the startup engagement with analysts. There'll be a recording of this eventually online. If you want to get hold of it, then drop us a line, and of course reach out to the speakers if you would like to know anything more about this study. So thank you so much for your time, all of you.
Thanks, Duncan.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye bye.